Hey everyone. This time we read Reality is Broken by Mcgonigal. So when I first read this book, I thought I was going to be getting into a discussion about how video games affect our lives, regardless of whether that's like a positive or a negative thing. Kind of seeing how video games, at least taken to the extreme, will affect somebody when they think about what's going on in the real world. That's not really what we get, and I should honestly stop going into these things with some idea of what they're about because I am never right. The book is divided up into three sections. Each section has a few chapters to it. I don't really like this, and I honestly don't think one of the sections is really. Well, it's needed in the book, but it's not really something that I cared that much about. I got more interested in it as I was going through it, but when I first started, I was like, this doesn't really have to do with video games, this has to do with, like, real life games, which is not what I wanted to read about. First section starts out with two things that I really, really like. It's a definition of what a game is, and also it goes into a little bit about how games have affected our real lives. Like, so she talks a little bit about how, gaming the system, the terminology behind games, and how that's been equated to be sort of a bad thing. And I think she's kind of speculating on how that's affected video games in some way, how they aren't seen as, like, things to be taken seriously, which most of them aren't, but it's a really interesting discussion. The second part is her sort of describing different types of work. She kind of equates playing video games to being work, and I can see with their definitions why that makes a lot of sense. And when you get into it, it all really does like make a lot of sense the way she lays things out, especially the way she sets up all of her definitions of work. So in her definitions of work, she says it's got to be an activity with like a defined goal, a set of rules that you adhere to, and there has to be like some kind of like a rewarding achievement at the end of it. All of this fits most video games. There are a few that don't really have like an actual reward system, or the reward that you get is definitely not the one that you want, but all of them have something like that in them in some way, shape, or form. It's at this point I should mention that this book is from 2011, so it's rather dated by today's standards. A lot of the examples Jane's going to use don't really make a lot of sense in today's time with the changes in the video game industry. We'll get into that near the end of the book when I kind of discuss some things that I don't really like about this book. Next, it goes into two concepts that I want to talk about. It's the concept of happiness, which she uses another book that we've done for this review series, that is David Sudnow's Breakout, and then she talks about the concept of failure in video games. I really like these two sections, especially since I enjoyed David Sundow's book, Breakout, and I also like her talk about failure, even though I think it's a little weird. She categorizes things like losses in video games as failure, or deaths in video games as failure, and that's never something that I've really thought about. I always thought, oh, I screwed up, I'll try it again. I've never seen, like Mario hitting a Goomba and dying as being a failure. It's just, okay, well now I know to jump over that stupid thing. To go on a little bit more about her talk about failure, she uses, and this is the first one where I really had kind of an issue, she uses a bunch of party games as her examples for failure, and I really had to kind of question that and bite my tongue a little bit while I was reading this, because the games she lists, they don't have anything to do with that. They're just meant to be played for fun. You're not really trying to do a lot of things, so failure in those games is totally irrelevant. So the last thing I want to mention in this first section is when she talks about social games. Now, she talks a lot about like the Facebook browser games, and she specifically calls out one that I was super confused about and had never heard of before, and honestly I had to go on my phone and see if the app was actually for sale and then read through the reviews for that. But again, that's me thinking with a 2020 mindset and not with her 2010 mindset for this book when it was written. And so you see like the two big differences between the two. Back when she was actually writing this, those games were a big thing. Like a lot of the Facebook app games, they were a much bigger thing. So those browser games were just kind of a weird thing for me, and it was just something where I wasn't reading it with the right thought process. I was kind of still reading it with a more modern one, as opposed to looking at the time that she was writing it, what the research she was getting was bearing out. So the social aspect of those games made more sense as you're using your friends list to kind of progress through the game. Sort of like, think Farmville, where you needed more friends to get a bigger farm, and also your friends could come over to your farm and water the crops and whatnot, if I'm even remembering Farmville correctly. So now we get into the second section of the book, and this covers about 4 chapters, and I'm just going to run through it really quick because this is a section of the book that I really didn't care that much about. I like the ideas for it, I like the certain things that she talks about in it, and I liked a lot of the directions that she was going. This section talks about alternate reality games, sort of those games that you would play in real life. So you would have, say like Pokemon Go is probably the most recent example. You're walking around with your cell phone looking for Pokemon and hopefully not walking off a cliff while you're doing it. Jane uses a few other games which kind of sound a little bit like experiments to me, like the sociological ones or something along those lines, to see how people in cities react to, interacting with new people. And that kind of is pretty cool for me, and I think that should have kind of been its own book, or at least that idea could be its own book. It's really cool to read about this stuff, just the way that the developers did it, and the kind of data that they were trying to get a hold of. So the last section of this book focuses more on the practical applications of video games, specifically looking at alternate reality games. And that was something that I didn't really like that much, because I feel like you can learn just as much from an alternate reality game as you can from a computer or console game. Of course, it depends on the audience that you're looking for, and it depends on the type of game that you're making. That's actually one of my criticisms of this book, is Jane paints a very broad brush across all of video games. It's kind of like she ignores different genres and everything along those lines to just kind of get this is this grand sweeping definition of video games. This is what video games can do, and it's just something weird for me that I don't really like that much about it. I do like that she talks about the alternate reality games, even though I think that should be another book. I didn't really like a lot of the examples that she used, because I felt even at the time of her writing it, there were better examples that were out there that probably would have worked a lot better. So anyway, that's going to wrap it up, guys. Please let me know what you think in the comments below, and have a great day.